Despite waves of colonization, Taiwan's indigenous people today number almost 500,000. Now, as they seek greater autonomy and land rights, they're looking to Canada for lessons on how to proceed. Joining us via Skype from London, England to explain is Linda Horst, Global Journalism Fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs. Linda, hello, welcome to the agenda.
Hi, Pia.
Okay, give me an introduction, give most Canadians an introduction to the indigenous people of Taiwan. Who are they?
So they are an Austronesian people, so they do look distinctly different from Han Chinese, contrary to what a lot of people think. Taiwan was actually long inhabited by Austronesian people. They belong to other indigenous tribes around the Pacific, such as in the Philippines and Malaysia. And recent research suggests that they were even there thousands of years before Han Chinese migration started, it's still disputed. But it signals that these indigenous people have been there for a long time before any colonization started in the 16th, 17th century.
Well, as we know, Taiwan has been colonized over the years many times. Just bring us through that as it pertains to these indigenous people.
So the Dutch came to Taiwan first to sort of set up trading posts, but they were shortly after kicked out by the Chinese, and they reigned for 100 to 200 years. And then the Japanese, at the end of the 1800s, signed a treaty with the Qing dynasty, and they started the colonization of the country. And they were they were quite brutal to the indigenous people in Taiwan.
And now the Han Chinese majority in Taiwan, what are the main grievances between the indigenous people and that majority?
So the Japanese, when they came, before the nationalists came, the Japanese, they nationalized a lot of the land of these indigenous people. And then in 1949, when the nationalists lost the civil war in China, fled to Taiwan, and basically took over just everything that the Japanese had left behind. So there was no sort of giving back that land to the indigenous people. And that process is still not completed, even though about a decade ago, there was an Indigenous Basic Act that was passed, sort of recognizing that indigenous people have land rights. But so far, a lot of land from the indigenous communities, they're still in the hands of the government, or there's sort of uncertainty as to who controls that.
And so they've been fighting over land, as we often hear, between indigenous peoples, no matter where they are in the world, and the colonizer and what comes after. But there's always this question also about cultural colonization. And have these people been able to retain their indigenous culture through the years?
Well, under the Japanese rule, this was forbidden to practice their own language and culture. And then the nationalists came, and when they came, they were really afraid of sort of external power. They were still afraid of the communists in China, and they sort of they very much centralized the education and tried to instill this homogeneous Han Chinese identity on the indigenous. So like a lot of these languages of these indigenous tribes have actually gone extinct. And in recent years, there's sort of been a reinvigoration of, the indigenous pride and the language in local schools. But because of, 100 years of colonization, this is, culturally, there's a lot of languages that have gone.
And just, when we think of Canada's indigenous people, there's various roots to them, there's various cultures, various languages, various ways they practice ceremonies, various ways that they live life. Is it the same with the people in Taiwan? Is it a really diverse grouping of people?
Yeah, so far there are 14. So you have to imagine this is a very, very small island. Only 23 million people live on this very small island. It's very densely populated as well in some areas. And there are 14 so far officially recognized groups. And some of these groups, they still are fighting for official recognition as an indigenous group from from the central government. But yeah, there is quite a diverse group of indigenous people. And then there's also a distinction between the plains tribes and the mountainous tribes. And the plains tribes were more into agriculture and fishing, whereas the mountainous tribes are more hunter-gatherers.
All right, so now they've been meeting with Canada's Indigenous people over the years, as I understand it, yes?
Yes, this exchange has been going on for quite a while.
Okay, and what are they talking about?
Various things, cultural exchanges, learning from each other's land rights experiences. It goes as far as intellectual property rights for indigenous people in terms of their culture and their music, etc.
I'm not sure how familiar you are with the situation of many people, First Nations people in Canada, but the economic situation compared to quote unquote mainstream Canada is often quite desperate. How does Taiwan's Indigenous population compare to its mainstream population in terms of economic development?
In that sense, they are much better integrated because it's such a small island. They are not so, geographically not so remote from the main centers, even though there are certain, barriers in terms of access to economic markets. And also the trains on the eastern coast where most of the indigenous people live, they're usually fully booked with tourists. But overall, in general, they are much better integrated into the economy than the Canadian First Nations. But that also comes at a cost because the indigenous people in Taiwan, they live in these areas that, because there's so very little land, they're faced with modernization and gentrification and appropriation of land for development and tourist sites, and because there's so little of it, that is quite a contentious issue.
I want to get back to, you said there were 14 groups of these in this very small country, and in Canada there's a movement, Idle No More, which is really bringing First Nations and Indigenous people together to raise their voices and try to affect change that they say has long been deserved and earned and should be coming. Is there anything similar to Idle No More in Taiwan?
Not in that sense, but there is a growing sort of awareness and pride of being Indigenous. And some professors, like one professor, Scott Simon in Canada, has said it would be nice if this rising awareness of Indigenous people can be sort of communicated to the non-Indigenous people in Taiwan. But there is there's more awareness also outside of the Indigenous groups on Taiwanese Indigenous issue, and that's mostly because of popular culture. There's quite a few, arts, indie kind of movies that have been brought out in the recent years that deal with Indigenous issues. And there's also more of awareness among Han Chinese majority that they often have Indigenous blood. So there's a saying that if you're Han Chinese and you've been in Taiwan long enough, there's a really big chance that you have some Indigenous blood in you. And with this awareness with this the growing pride of Taiwanese versus Chinese, there's also more Taiwanese who are becoming more aware of their own distinct heritage that distinguishes them from Chinese.
And as that awareness builds, and as pop culture, as you say, we're having some similar moments here in Canada where pop culture is actually helping drive a lot of the awareness and change. There's also a new president coming in Taiwan, and she seemed to be quite progressive on this file, if I could call it that, on that front. Tell me about her.
Yes, that's Tsai Ing-wen. She is the first female president, and also she has led the most progressive government to power in the recent elections a few weeks ago. People sometimes describe her as the German Angela Merkel because she is so, down to business. And she is actually very progressive, and not just on Indigenous rights. She has also been very progressive on, advancing gay rights on the island.
And is there hope among the Indigenous population of Taiwan that with this new president, that things will improve for them, that they will get recognition, perhaps an apology?
Yeah, so she has already promised an apology on Indigenous Peoples' Day in August. And because it's the most progressive parliament that Taiwan has seen in its history, it is also quite people are optimistic that this will actually bring about some real change for Indigenous people. It was also under the previous liberal presidents, which did not have a liberal majority in parliament, but it was under the previous liberal president that they passed the Indigenous Basic Act. And so they're hoping, a lot of Indigenous rights activists are hoping that Tsai Ing-wen will bring some real change to Taiwan. But having said that, there are some priorities for Taiwan that are perhaps more on her priority lists for when she takes office in May.
Linda, we began our interview by me asking you to introduce Canadians to the Indigenous people of Canada. I want to end our interview by asking, what do you think Canadians need to know when we look at our own Indigenous communities and the ones that you have explained to us in Taiwan? What do we need to understand?
It is such a small island, and still there's such diversity on that little island, and they are trying really hard to live together and to solve these issues. And Canada is such a big country with such vast amounts of land, so it might be even easier to find space for everyone.
Linda van der Horst, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.